Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another lecture for early US history. This one is going to be another thematic lecture, so it's going to cover a theme, an overarching theme of several decades. And in this case, the theme is going to be some social and religious changes that occur during these decades. And it's going to be the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, both of which occur during this era, during the 1730s stretching through the 1760s. And these occurrences, these changes in early American society are going to help better understand how and why the American Revolution is going to occur. Because this is kind of what we're tracing now, is the development of sentiment that will lead to a revolution in 1775. So, starting with the Enlightenment, what is it and how does it start? The Enlightenment is here we go. The Enlightenment is a phenomenon, a social phenomenon that begins in Europe around 1685, that begins because there's been so much exploration of the globe and so much new scientific knowledge that has been garnered due to all of this exploration, all of the scientific knowledge that is needed to further even more exploration. So the Enlightenment begins in this time. It starts with the growth of with the more exploration, more scientific knowledge. But what exactly is it? The Enlightenment is a global intellectual shift, and it's considered a shift from a society in which globally generally leans more towards religion to understand the world around it, to using science as the explanation for natural phenomenon and for things that occur. It's called the Enlightenment because people become enlightened. They're moving out of what a lot of leading minds of the day consider the Dark Ages and into a more advanced society that has a better grasp on why certain natural phenomenon occurs. Uh, it's really reflected in a lot of art of the period. There's so many paintings like this one here where people are just very excited about new scientific knowledge, about figuring out a really good explanation for things like why the planets move the way they do, weather patterns, all of this stuff. They're exploring, they're doing experiments, and they're trying to learn more about the world around them, where they're not just explaining things by superstition or myth. There's an actual logical scientific explanation for things. It's very much a society that looks to rationalize the world. There has to be a rational, logical, scientific explanation for almost anything. If you can't explain it, you have to experiment and figure out a way to explain it. So this is something that you start to see more of in 1685, more scientists, more thinkers, mathematicians and astronomers and whatnot that have really been encouraged to do this because, as I mentioned earlier, there is just a lot more exploration going on. So people start to wonder, okay, we didn't know there were some giant continents out there that we discovered in the 1400s. What else might be out there? It really stimulates the curiosity to see how many different things there are and wonder if there's more to be discovered. So it's a turn away from a more blind faith, as some put it, to trying to find a more solid footing for what goes on in the world. And the Enlightenment is going to affect very heavily things like understanding of government. So this is why we learn about this always in early US history. Okay, question number one for you. What was the Enlightenment? I even put it on the top of the screen, a little treat. There you go. So that's the Enlightenment, why it starts. But I want to talk a little bit now. Of course, I mentioned how it kind of moves a little bit away from religion, but it doesn't erase it. It doesn't actually supersede it in a way. Sometimes it bolsters it. So it's not something that some people will see it as a threat to religion, but the Enlightenment isn't setting out to be as such. It's supposed to be just a little bit less blind faith and more in-depth analysis of one's faith, perhaps. But we'll go into it a little further here. So the Enlightenment doesn't totally erase religion, and there are people, even Enlightenment thinkers, who use science to bolster their faith. It actually makes them more devout. It doesn't make them turn away from religion. It actually strengthens their belief. And one of those people was Sir Isaac Newton's pictured here. And in 1687, so nice heart, this is like the kickoff of the Enlightenment type of stuff. 1687, he publishes his treatise here, Principia Mathematica. And what this is a book that where Newton publishes all of his theories that we now know, things like the laws of motion and universal gravitation. And in this Principia Mathematica, Newton argues that there are certain natural laws that help us understand the universe that are always in play. Like gravity applies universally, the laws of motion, laws of physics, and he talks about them here in this text. And what's interesting about things like Newton's writings is that they don't say this proves that God isn't real. It's not what that says. It actually says that, look, I've uncovered how God set up the universe. And exploring that makes me more pious, more devout. It makes me a better Christian. And that type of religion is known as deism. It's written here, Deism, deism. Deism is an idea that all of those natural theories were simple, all of those processes like gravity and the currents and the way the planets move, those were all natural processes that were set up by God, and it's up to people to figure out how they work, and by doing so, it brings you closer to God. So it doesn't negate God, it doesn't negate religion. It actually helps understand religion more. People feel like they're getting closer to God by understanding the world he set up. So this is falls under the umbrella of something known as natural theology, where you're very scientific, you're very precise, you're very rational, but your curiosity is stimulated by a desire to better understand the world as God set it up. How did God put the ocean currents into movement? How did he set up the weather, the seasons? The more you investigate that, the closer you are to understanding, God's plans and God's desires. And a lot of natural theologists felt that the evidence of this was in how complex the universe and the world was. Looking at the mathematical sequences on a pine cone, or just how complicated, if you look like really closely at the inner workings of a flower, the idea was that nobody but someone as powerful as God could have set these things in motion, about how perfectly the seasons change and just how time works, how gravity works, the planets moving, the stars shifting. It all seemed to be evidence of a higher power. And a lot of these thinkers they called this the clockmaker theory, which means that they felt that the world was so complicated, it was all put together like the pieces of a clock. What God did was set that up and then leave. So the world just operates as God intended it to. He doesn't need to intervene because it's all set to work perfectly, just as it was designed to. So a lot of people, they don't lose their religion because of this scientific enlightenment. They become even more devout, even more curious about figuring out how God set the world up, and they call this natural theology. So, question number two, what is natural theology? So I talk a lot about enlightenment being rationalization. There is kind of a rationalization due to all of these scientific advancements, an attempt to almost rationalize religion, that there's a rational way to understand it. There's also an attempt with all of this new scientific knowledge to rationalize politics as well. It's not just something, this enlightenment is not just something that influences religion, it also influences political thought and theory as well. Probably one of the most famous individuals of the Enlightenment era is John Locke. And John Locke was an English philosopher. He's also a physician. And a lot of his rational political theories would be extremely consequential in the American colonies and influence a lot their desire to create a government that followed these rules. And these are political theories that form the foundation of the United States government. That's a spoiler. But this is kind of where that starts. Some of the ideas of government that the founders would adopt come from John Locke. One of John Locke's rational approaches to politics was that he felt that anybody who wanted to run a good government needed to respect the fact that God had endowed all people with natural rights. The idea that it was something God had given to all of the people that he created and it could never be alienated or taken away. And those natural rights were those to life, liberty, and property. So Locke theorizes on that that is the best way to run a government is for rulers to respect those natural rights, life, liberty, and property. But Locke was also big on what has been deemed contract theory. And contract theory means that government is a contract. Government rule is a contract. People have a contract with their government, a social contract that their consent, their will puts a leader in power. And once the people's will has changed, that leader no longer has legitimate power. Uh, the government should do as the people wish. There should not be despotic, tyrannical law because that violates that social contract where, okay, you as the leader are in charge because the people wish it. That's the only way to have legitimate power. And these ideas are just further developed and made popular by two other political theorists of the time. One is the Baron de Montesquieu, who was a French philosopher, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a Swiss theorist. And some of the big ideas that they really expanded upon was the idea that a rational, logical government would have a separation of power, where power could never and should never rest with one particular person, because that was just a recipe for disaster. If you had power that was all resting in the hands of one person, that person was always going to become a despot or a tyrant. And that's just not rational because if you give one person all this power, what's to say that they're not going to be a bad leader? That's dangerous. It's not right. So they were big on the idea of separating power. You should not have a monarchy because that's just not a very good form of government. If you go deeper into the readings of some of these individuals, they really expand this idea and say things such as, well, hereditary rule is great and all until you get a really bad person that's born. There's no guarantee that a great leader is going to have a genius son who's going to carry on and be just as good of a leader. You can't risk that. You have to have separation of powers, branches of government. That should sound very familiar. So these are ideas that will eventually heavily, heavily influence the formation of the United States' government. Okay, where was I? Question three. What were some of John Locke's beliefs regarding government? So the Enlightenment thinkers, philosophers, scientists, doctors, writers, you name it, they're a very positive bunch. They're very hopeful. And they have a lot of values that influence and drive their theories and thoughts and just their way of thinking, and some of the values that really encapsulate and embody what it is to be an Enlightenment thinker or following the Enlightenment are as follows. Um, a lot of Enlightenment thought revolved around a belief in ongoing progress, that the world could be improved and is constantly improving, that it's moving in a very linear direction, it's progressing towards a more advanced, rational, wholesome society. Enlightenment is also very much about science, that science and scientific thought will help understand the world and help make it a better place. That's where that progress was growing from, was scientific advancement, that science would bring about progress. And another big value is that of individualism, that there needed to be more emphasis on the right and protection of the individual, protection from government, and protection from any type of power that would threaten the will of the individual, the single person. There's also an emphasis on tolerance, especially religious tolerance, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Mostly because Enlightenment thinkers believe that it was irrational to be intolerant of people. It made no sense to persecute people for beliefs that, especially if those beliefs were not harmful. If you were practicing a certain religion and you don't bother anybody, why should you be yourself bothered? Also, a very strong belief in social mobility, the idea that anybody should and could be able to improve themselves in society and better themselves if they put in the work and did the right thing. And that coincides very heavily with the belief in human equality, that everybody is born equal and has the same opportunities or should have the same opportunities to advance, that even if certain opportunities did not present themselves, that everybody should be able to, if they tried, to get somewhere. Like you should not be barred from success simply because maybe you were of lower birth or of peasant birth or something. So they are a very positive, optimistic bunch. You know, they have all of these very enlightened values that they felt made them the more rational, more progressive thinking group of the time. So so I wanna, before I move on with this, let me just give you the fourth question here, which is, what were some of the values of the Enlightenment? We talked about tolerance and talked about religion and how that played a big part. I want to talk now a little bit of background about religion in colonial America before we talk about the next part of this, the next theme in this lecture, which will be about a religious awakening in the American colonies. So, a little bit of background about the religious landscape of colonial America. It was very much a religiously pluralistic society, colonial America, which means that there was no one single dominant religion that took precedence. No religion that had to be practiced. It was very much a Christian society, uh, but there was not a formal religion in the colonies. Like some countries were, the church of that country was a Catholic church or a Protestant church. There was no one church, there was no one specific ordained religion that was adopted by the government and you tell everybody that they have to practice it. So because England was not really powerful enough to extend itself that far, where they could tell everybody in North America, you have to be Protestant. So they just couldn't get away with that. So part of the reason that the colonies are religiously pluralistic is because there's no way to enforce one single religion, and because of that, naturally, you just have a lot of religions there. A religiously pluralistic society is one that has many religions being practiced, many religions just in play. People are um, devotees of different religions. And part of the reason why that is the case, why are there so many religions being practiced? I kind of gave one away for you. One of the reason why there are so many religions in practice in colonial America, North America, is because in English society they weren't strong enough, they didn't have enough of a presence there. You know, they didn't control all of the land, so they couldn't control everyone's religious practices, and that's a lot of work. I mean, that's going all the way across the Atlantic Ocean just to make sure everybody's practicing as a Protestant. I don't know, there's other things to worry about. But a big one, a big reason why there are so many religions in practice in colonial America is because there is so much immigration to the continent of North America. A lot of different people are coming to North America because they are hoping that that lack of oversight by an empire will allow them to freely practice their religion. Some examples of some of the religions that immigrant groups bring in, the Huguenots, the French Huguenots, they are French Protestants. They are the Protestants that are persecuted by the French Catholic Church. They were told that they had to convert to Catholicism or they would be killed. There's pictured here of the persecution of the Huguenots being killed by the French government for not being Catholic. A French Huguenot is simply a French Protestant. So the French Huguenots come to North America to escape persecution in France. You also have a lot of Jewish immigrants who are coming to North America to escape persecution, particularly in Russia. There was a lot of persecution of Jewish people in Russia at the time. So many of them leave Russia to come and settle in the Americas. A lot of them end up in New York and Pennsylvania. Also, of course, the Amish, they were a German religion. They settle very heavily in Pennsylvania, and they're still there. You could go visit Lancaster County. And of course, there were also plenty of African religions that arrived with enslaved individuals being taken over from Africa. Many of them do adopt Christianity or some other form of a European religion, but plenty of them also do retain their African religions. So you do have these religions being practiced in North America. So lots and lots of people, lots of different religions. It was a very diverse, very energetic religious landscape for a while. So where am I? Let me look at this here. Number five, here we are. Why were there so many religions in colonial North America? Okay, so talking about religion, this time period is also when a social phenomenon known as the Great Awakening occurs. And the Great Awakening is a series of religious revivals, so attempts to reinvigorate faith. And they occur in the American colonies because there are a lot of religious leaders that are very concerned about some lackluster faith. They're worried that people are not quite as zealous or not quite as pious or devout as they should be. They're getting kind of lazy with their religious practices. And a lot of religious leaders feel that this getting kind of tired and unzealous, unenthusiastic about religion is because there's been so much commercialization that people are more concerned with making money than with worshiping God. They're also very worried and feeling pretty threatened by that rationalism that is being encouraged by the Enlightenment, even though the Enlightenment is very much enthusiastic about tolerance, and many of them are very religious figures themselves. They don't want to discount God. I think it's understandable that some religious figures would feel that science and rationalism and logic is a threat to faith because a lot of faith is supposed to be blind. You're not supposed to be able to prove God is real to believe in him. That's part of what makes faith faith. You don't have to see it to believe it. And plenty of religious figures felt that this whole, hypothesis method of understanding God's world was making people less concerned with that faith. And plenty of religious leaders were also concerned that part of the reason why everybody was falling asleep in church was because the sermons had gotten super dull and nobody really felt any zeal anymore. It was just a very unemotional, uninspired kind of way of preaching the gospel or of reading from the Bible or understanding scripture. So you had some of these things motivating the Great Awakening, and that is also question number six here. What motivated the occurrence of the Great Awakening? Kickstarts here in about 1740. As I mentioned, something that did kind of kickstart it is this idea that, oh no, we're kind of boring now. And how do we combat that is to be the answer is to be not boring. And so that's part of what makes the Great Awakening this great awakening is it's this real attempt to reawaken faith in God and to jolt people into a realization that God is great and needs to be worshipped accordingly. One of the people that will take up this mantle is a Connecticut minister known as named Jonathan Edwards. And he pioneers a very emotional style of sermon designed to reawaken faith in God and also to just remind people that God is really powerful and you should be terrified of him. You should be terrified about what you do and how you act because God is extremely powerful and also very mad at a lot of people for the way they've been acting. Jonathan Edwards is really famous for a particular sermon that he gives in 1741 that's titled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And within this sermon, what Edwards just lays into his congregants. He basically talks about, if you can read the full text online, you can even actually find, you go on YouTube, watch a video of, if it's still up, you could listen to it, of someone in period costume reading this sermon. It's a terrifying sermon. When it was given in 1741, people were fainting in church because of how fiery this sermon is. Edwards tells his listeners that God is the only one holding you out of hell right now. You better make sure you keep him happy. You're lucky to be where you are. You are lucky he doesn't just toss you into the fires of hell right now. You are all horrible sinners. God is extremely angry at you, but it's his benevolence that keeps you from the pits of hell. And that's pretty terrifying to people, but it also kind of it injects some emotion into sermons that had prior to this been pretty lackluster. It's mostly reading from the Bible or just reading from scripture and taking lessons from that. To kind of bring emotionalism back into it is something new, and it encourages people to think a little bit more deeply about their religious faith. Okay, question number 7. Who was Jonathan Edwards and what did he do? Another important figure of this Great Awakening, this religious revival that sweeps through North America, important figure is George Whitefield. He was actually English, and he tours the American colonies beginning in 1739, and he is extremely popular. He's a very popular minister, very popular orator, and his sermons draw enormous, enormous crowds. He is so popular. His presence is so popular, and it results in so much renewed religious faith that he actually inspires the formation of several new branches of Christian religion and Christian worship. You have Methodism, Baptism. These are all results of George Whitefield's presence. He is that popular, he's that good of a speaker that people are actually creating new religions out of this. That's pretty impressive. Even, what's another one? Presbyterian Church comes out because of George Whitefield. New churches founded, that's pretty impressive. But why though? You have to be thinking, okay, yeah, he's great, he's a great speaker, but how is he getting people to build a new church and create a whole new denomination out of this? He has a very unique message that people really, really like. George Whitefield's message is there is no such thing as predestination. Do you remember that from the Puritans lecture? Pretty sure I mentioned that in that, where Puritans believed in that Calvinism, that predestination, that God, because he is all powerful, has already decided where you are going. Before you were even born, before you were even a glimmer in your parents' eye, your soul's destination was already determined by God, if you were going to heaven or if you were going to hell. And nothing you did was going to change that. George Whitefield says throw that right out the door. That is not true. You, as the individual, have the power to make decisions and do certain things that will alter your eternal destiny. If you are a good person and you do good deeds, that will win you a spot in heaven. You will earn your place up above. But if you are a bad, evil sinner, you will go to hell, and God will make the ultimate judgment when you die. That's really important and really inspiring to a lot of people. Wow, me, it's myself, I have the power to change my eternal destiny. What I do will matter. He words it extremely well that people start to feel quite powerful in the fact that even as a mortal, your actions on earth can help determine where you will go after you die. It also makes people filled with this vigor to do good and to be more devout because you want God to look back upon your life as one of service and of piety. So a lot of people really flock to this very empowering message of George Whitefield. Question number 8. What was George Whitefield's message? What was his argument? I want to now take a minute to talk a little bit about and just reiterate how the ideas of both of these movements, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, how they will begin to have a revolutionary impact on the conflict that will eventually form the United States. So, just to kind of give it to you straight out. A big reason why the Enlightenment influences revolutionary thought is because a lot of it comes from the ideas that would form the United States government. The idea of separation of powers and power being derived from the will of the people. That you have to split power up. You can't just have one person in control. And you also have to make sure that the people consent, that power comes from the consent of the governed. Those Enlightenment ideas were all about something rational. You know, it's irrational to have a tyrant or a dictator. That's what influences the thoughts of the American Revolution. The Great Awakening does this as well because it really emphasizes individualism and the idea that actions here on Earth can have really severe impact, really profound impacts, that it gives people a sense of self-confidence and empowerment about changing their destiny, taking their life into their own hands, doing what they think is right. And it also gives the American people a sense of individuality and a sense of uniqueness from Europe that had happened here, that this new message of um, self-empowerment really emerges in the colonies and gives them something that makes them socially different from Britain. And it's going to be these changes too that make them feel that will start to make the American colonists feel less and less connected with England. It will give them more of a sense of their own identity. So a lot of influences here. Hope this is kind of setting up things that will encourage an eventual revolution, an eventual separation from England. So, question number 9, how did the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment influence the American Revolution? Okay, one last thing to here, one last question, because these two movements, these two social phenomenons will also impact the way that Americans regarded slavery. So, both of these phenomenons, Enlightenment and Great Awakening, yes, they have very consequential impacts on the thought processes that will encourage a revolution, but they're also going to start making Americans think differently about the institution of slavery. And one of the reasons why the Enlightenment encourages this, how it impacts views regarding slavery is because one of those values that a lot of Enlightenment thinkers held dear was human equality. And if all men are created equal, then how can you justify and rationalize enslaving certain parts of the human population? Slavery also seemed to violate the idea of human progress and of that ability of people to become socially mobile. It also just seemed very irrational to have violence and inequality in any society that wanted to be very scientific, very, advanced and lofty, is to have cruelty based on race and to have enslavement, something that really seemed very ancient and outdated because Enlightenment thinkers very much prided themselves on being cutting edge, really, and being more advanced, very civilized, very high-minded. And this just went against all of those principles. But particularly the idea that all humans were created equal and this just you could not bring these two together. You just could not rationalize slavery if you also believed in any semblance of equality. The Enlightenment also does have an impact on thoughts about slavery because that idea of doing good deeds on earth getting you into heaven makes a lot of people think, ugh, if we're enslaving other people, that's not going to be something that God would probably look very fondly upon. And that might influence or impact our ability to get into heaven. If you are cruel to other humans, why should God look favorably upon you at the end of your life? So it makes a lot of people think that I need to clean my act up and treat other people better. But it also, more philosophically, the Great Awakening brings this sense that all humans can control their destiny, which means they're all powerful. We're all special. We're all unique in God's eyes. So preventing another one of God's children from being able to lead a fulfilling life seems to violate that idea that the Enlightenment held so dear, that people are all special and should be allowed to lead a full life because everybody is capable of salvation. And you might be preventing somebody from reaching that if you have enslaved them or if you're not allowing them to reach their full potential. So there is a lot of effects on thoughts about slavery, and it's a lot of these Enlightenment ideas that abolitionists, those who want to see slavery abolished, will use to argue in their favor about why slavery should be made illegal, and why a lot of American founders would argue very heavily that, getting a little ahead of myself here, but when there is the formation of the new United States government, many of them would be pretty ardent about wanting slavery to be illegal in this new country. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the actual American Revolution. I promise it's coming up. Final question, question number 10. How did the ideas of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening impact the views Americans held regarding slavery? Okay, so that is the conclusion of this lecture. Again, this was a theme, so we didn't go through like a timeline of events. The next lecture will be more of a chronology. We're going to be discussing the French and Indian War. That is going to be something else that's going to really bring the English American colonies closer to a revolution.